My parents drained my college fund to settle their debts and insisted I work instead of pursuing my education, so I cut ties with them and moved to a different state. But they managed to track down my new address and began harassing me. Growing up, I never really felt like a cherished child, more like an unwelcome obligation. It was clear that my parents hadn't exactly dreamed of having me. My dad, a corporate lawyer in his mid-50s, and my mom, a real estate agent in her early 50s, were more focused on keeping up their upper-middle-class image than nurturing their only daughter. They'd had me when they were relatively young, and I often got the impression that my presence disrupted the lifestyle they wanted to maintain. In our household, appearances were everything. My parents were obsessed with portraying themselves as successful and put together, but behind closed doors, it was a different story. Looking back, I now realize I wasn't treated like a daughter. They saw me as unpaid help. Any dreams or achievements I had didn't matter. If I came home with straight A's or won an award, they'd shrug and say, "Well, that's what you're supposed to do, right?" Over time, I learned that their approval was tied to how much I contributed to their image or eased their burdens. Things took a turn for the worse during my senior year of high school. Out of nowhere, my mom stopped working. She never explained whether she was laid off or quit voluntarily. She just left the workforce entirely. Around the same time, my dad was fired from the law firm where he'd worked for years. With both of them unemployed, their once perfect lifestyle began to crumble. Suddenly, they were struggling to keep up with mortgage payments, bills, and all the luxuries they'd taken for granted. Their frustration and desperation? All directed at me. I was doing my best, balancing school, a part-time job, and saving every dollar I could for college. Eventually, I earned a scholarship that would cover most of my tuition. I thought this was huge, a lifeline, given our financial struggles. But when I shared the news, hoping for at least a flicker of pride or encouragement, they saw dollar signs instead. My dad began making not-so-subtle comments about how I should give up the scholarship, stay home, and work full-time to help with their bills. My mom chimed in too, saying that college can wait, and that a real adult would put family first. The final blow came when I found out that the modest college savings fund my late grandfather had set up for me was gone. They drained it completely to cover their debts, and they didn't even bother to tell me. When I confronted them, there were no apologies, just cold justifications about how they had no other choice. I was heartbroken. It felt like they'd stolen my future. My dreams, my well-being, and my independence had always come second to their own comfort. At that moment, I knew I had to leave. At 18, I packed up what little I owned and moved to a nearby city to start college on my own. I worked whatever jobs I could, waitressing, tutoring, anything that would help me survive while I juggled my studies. It wasn't easy, but the distance from them felt like freedom. Even with all the struggles, I finally felt like I could breathe. I kept my contact with them minimal, holiday check-ins and brief obligatory calls. A part of me hoped that maybe the space and time apart would change things between us. But years passed, and after I finished my degree, I was offered a full-time job in another state, an incredible opportunity. That job offer felt like the culmination of everything I'd worked for: a solid salary, great benefits, and the chance to finally build a stable, independent life. So, I moved again, this time hundreds of miles away, and began a new chapter. The sense of freedom was incredible. I could afford my own apartment, surround myself with friends who genuinely cared about me, and live life on my own terms. It felt like a dream come true. For the first time, I was exactly where I was meant to be. 2 years passed in that new life, and during that time, I didn't hear a single word from my parents. I naively thought they'd finally accepted that I was done bending over backward to meet their expectations. But last week, out of nowhere, I got a message from them. They claimed they wanted to reconnect and were planning a visit, complete with a special surprise for me. They kept insisting that I'd be thrilled by this so-called surprise, acting as if nothing had ever happened between us. It was as if we were just a regular family who drifted apart due to life's busyness. Their message left me speechless. After all these years of silence, here they were, pretending they hadn't spent most of my life manipulating and controlling me. They were behaving as if we shared some heartwarming family bond that could be rekindled with a simple visit. They hinted that whatever surprise they had in store would make things right between us, whatever that was supposed to mean. Given our history, all I could feel was suspicion. Every surprise they'd ever given me had been a thinly veiled attempt to guilt-trip or control me. When I politely declined their visit, the fallout came quickly. I started receiving messages from other family members, all piling on the guilt. They said things like, "Your parents just miss you. They're reaching out because they care." And, "It's time to let the past go." Some even implied that I was the one being cruel, that I was holding a grudge while my parents were simply trying to make amends. It felt like everyone conveniently forgot what I'd sacrificed to escape that toxic dynamic. I'd given up my peace of mind, my savings, and my dreams just to break free from their control. I put my own life on hold to keep them afloat, only to be tossed aside once they no longer needed me. And now that I'd finally built a life of my own, they wanted to barge back in. So here I am, torn between the family I was born into and the life I fought tooth and nail to create. Part of me wonders if I'm wrong for keeping my distance, for choosing myself over people who only saw me as a tool for their own comfort. I know what they're capable of. I know this so-called surprise is probably just another ploy to pull me back under their control. But despite all that, I can't shake the guilt they planted in me, the nagging thought that I somehow owe them something, just because they're my parents. So Reddit, am I wrong for wanting to stay free after everything they put me through? Am I selfish for refusing to let them back into my life now that I've finally carved out my own path? Update 1. First off, I want to say a huge thank you for all the support, advice, and kind words. The outpouring of encouragement has been overwhelming in the best way possible. Hearing from so many of you who've been through similar situations has been eye-opening, and your advice has really helped me gain some much-needed clarity. A lot of you pointed out something I hadn't initially considered, that my parents' entire approach to this so-called reconciliation was just another way to maintain control. The fact that they're planning to show up uninvited, dangling some vague surprise in front of me, likely something financial, shows they still don't understand, or worse, they don't care, about the damage they've done. If anything, it proves they still see me the same way they always did, as a pawn in their game. Someone they could control or pacify with money instead of facing the real issues. That's how they've always seen me. After I posted the main story, things took an unexpected turn all on their own. Yesterday morning, I got a call from my aunt, my mom's sister. She's usually more of a bystander than an active participant, but every now and then, she reaches out to offer family advice, whether I ask for it or not. She didn't waste any time getting to the point. "Why won't you let your parents visit? What's going on?" she asked, sounding genuinely confused. Apparently my parents had told her all about their plans, including the big surprise they'd been preparing for me. According to my aunt, my parents had supposedly been seeing a family therapist for the past year. They'd told her they'd been reflecting on their past mistakes and had come to terms with how they'd treated me. The grand surprise they were so eager to spring on me, a trust fund they'd set up in my name, using some of their savings as an apology and an attempt to make things right. My aunt seemed convinced that they believed this gesture would mend our relationship, that it was proof of their commitment to change. Hearing about the trust fund only left me more confused. On one hand, The fact that they'd saved up and created something they thought would benefit me felt like some kind of acknowledgement of their wrongs. A small part of me wanted to believe they'd really changed. But the more I thought about it, the more frustrated I became. Their so-called plan for reconciliation was still centered around money and grand gestures, the very things that had driven a wedge between us in the first place. It felt like they were trying to buy my forgiveness instead of rebuilding trust through honest communication and mutual respect. After hearing my aunt out, I knew I couldn't let this fester. It was time to address things head-on. That evening, I sat down and wrote a long email to my parents. I thanked them for the effort they claimed to have put into therapy and acknowledged that it was a significant step if they were truly taking responsibility for their actions. But I also made it clear that surprising me with a visit and using a financial gesture as an apology wasn't the right way to start rebuilding our relationship. I told them, plain and simple, that if they were serious about moving forward, it had to start with respecting my boundaries and showing a willingness to communicate directly about the past, not trying to buy their way back into my life. In the email, I was very upfront. I wouldn't agree to any visits or face-to-face meetings unless we first established some ground rules. I suggested starting small, regular phone calls or messages where we could gradually rebuild trust and have honest conversations about what happened in a way that felt safe for me. I explained that repairing our relationship would take time and consistency, not a one-time gift or grand gesture. I even pointed out that if their therapy was truly helping, they should already know that real reconciliation takes genuine work, not just money or surprises. The moment I hit send, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time in a long time, it felt like I was setting the terms of how things would go, not them. The next morning, I received their response, and, well, it was a lot. They started off polite enough, thanking me for my honesty, and saying they were willing to follow my lead if it meant fixing things. But as the email continued, the tone shifted. My mom launched into paragraphs about how families shouldn't need rules or boundaries, insisting that if I really wanted to make amends, I should have been open to letting them visit and talk in person. My dad's part was more direct. He wrote that he was hurt by my rejection of their gift, emphasizing how much effort they'd put into it. He said he felt disrespected by my refusal to accept what he saw as their attempt at reconciliation. By the end of the email, it felt like they were subtly shifting the blame onto me, as if I was the one sabotaging any chance of making things right. They were implying that by setting boundaries, I was the one refusing to reconcile. As if that wasn't bad enough, my mom added a comment about how I'd always been independent to a fault. That one really stung. In that moment, I realized they hadn't truly changed. They were still framing everything as my failure, my inability to be family-oriented or forgiving enough. Reading their words felt like another slap in the face, as though everything I'd shared about my struggles had been dismissed and twisted to paint me as ungrateful. Later that evening, my aunt called again. It was clear she'd spoken to my parents after they'd read my email, and now she was calling to reason with me. But it felt more like another guilt trip. She kept saying things like, "They're really trying, you know. It's not easy for them either. And maybe you're being a little too harsh. They just want to show you they've changed." She even mentioned that their therapist had encouraged them to reach out, and that the trust fund was a product of those therapy sessions, as if that justified their entire approach. It felt like everyone was trying to convince me that accepting their financial gesture would magically fix everything. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. By the end of that conversation with my aunt, I was emotionally drained. I was so tired of having to explain, again and again, that a one-time grand gesture couldn't replace years of genuine effort and accountability. I kept asking myself the same questions. Why couldn't they just respect what I needed? Why was it so hard for them to communicate directly and consistently, instead of turning everything into a performance? This whole situation felt like the same manipulation I'd grown up with, just dressed up in different words and actions. I feel like I'm being backed into a corner. It's as if setting boundaries makes me the villain in their narrative, like I'm the one who isn't trying hard enough to fix things. I never wanted any of this. I never wanted to be forced into the role of the ungrateful daughter, just because I'm not bending to their idea of how things should be. And now, with family members piling on, trying to pressure me to change my stance, I feel like I'm right back at square one, defending my choices and fighting for my autonomy. After everything I've been through, I know I don't deserve this. I've worked hard to build a life of my own, to break free from the manipulation and control that shaped my childhood. Update 2. I honestly didn't expect things to spiral the way they have over the past few days. After sending that last email and holding firm to my boundaries, I hoped my parents would take a step back and respect my decision. But things only became more complicated, and I'm starting to realize just how far they're willing to go to regain control. 2 days after my last post, I woke up to a text from an unknown number. It simply read, "Hope you're doing well in your new city. Don't think you can hide forever. We'll see you soon." My heart stopped. At first, I thought it was spam or a random scam message. But the more I reread it, the more unsettling it felt. There was something disturbingly familiar about the tone, reminiscent of the way my father would word things when he wanted me to feel guilty or uneasy about something. I tried to brush it off, but it left me rattled. Later that day, I received an email from my father. It was long and formal sounding, almost like something you'd get from a boss reprimanding you at work. He wrote about how disappointed he was by my response and my unwillingness to accept their olive branch. While there were no outright threats, the wording was deliberate and pointed. He emphasized that I was their only child and that, as their daughter, it was my moral responsibility to show some respect, meet them halfway, and at least acknowledge their attempts to reconcile. He even included a line about how they'd invested so much in my upbringing and education, making it seem like my independence and success were things I owed to them, and that I was obligated to stay connected out of gratitude. I was livid. But more than that, it confirmed what I'd feared. They had no intention of respecting my space. That evening, I called one of my closest friends, someone who'd known me and my family for years. She listened patiently as I vented, then calmly reminded me of something I needed to hear. My parents had always pushed boundaries. They'd never truly accepted the word no. My friend reminded me that this was probably their way of testing how far they could push before I broke and gave in. She told me it was okay to set boundaries and keep my distance, that I wasn't obligated to let them back into my life on their terms, especially when it was causing me so much stress. I felt an immense wave of relief, knowing that someone understood and validated what I was feeling. But of course, that relief didn't last long. The very next day, I noticed that both of my parents had followed me on Instagram. I'd always used that account to stay connected with my college friends, and I had intentionally kept it private, no family members allowed. Since they'd never been active on social media before, I hadn't thought to block them. But seeing their profiles pop up now felt unsettling, like they'd breached another layer of my privacy. What made it even creepier was noticing that my mom had liked some of my old posts, the most recent one from 2 years ago, back when I first moved to this state for work. It felt like a deliberate move, as if they were trying to remind me that they could still watch me from a distance. That night, I got another call from my aunt. She asked if I'd spoken to my parents recently, saying they were worried and didn't know how else to reach me since I'd been so closed off. Then she dropped a bombshell. They knew where I lived and were thinking about flying out for a quick visit to talk things out. Maya tried to make it sound casual, like it was no big deal. She insisted they just wanted to set things straight and give me some clarity about their intentions. but the way she said it made it painfully clear they'd already decided to come. She even had the nerve to tell me I was overreacting, that I was making the situation bigger than it needed to be. But the worst part was realizing they knew exactly where I lived. I'd never shared my address when I moved here 2 years ago. I wanted a fresh start, free from their interference. The idea that they'd found out through relatives, or maybe even an online search, made my skin crawl. I knew how persistent they could be, but having confirmation that they'd been quietly keeping tabs on me sent chills down my spine. I was horrified, but not entirely surprised. Feeling rattled, I emailed my parents again. I made it crystal clear that I wasn't comfortable with any surprise visits and reminded them, again, that I needed space. I told them that if they were serious about making amends, it had to be done respectfully, without tracking me down or following me on social media. I thought my tone was balanced, polite but firm. I hoped that if they took the time to read it carefully, they'd realize that showing up uninvited would only push me further away. Their response came almost immediately. My mother sent a long, guilt-tripping message about how they couldn't believe I was treating them like strangers. She went on about how it broke their hearts to see me so distant and ungrateful after everything they'd done for me. She talked about how family should always be there for each other, and claimed that they were only trying to support me in the way they thought I'd appreciate. The whole thing was framed as if they were doing me some huge favor by being so persistent, and I was just too stubborn to see their love for what it was. She even threw in the classic, "One day, you'll look back and regret pushing us away when all we wanted was to help you heal from the past." Reading that message drained me. It felt like all my energy was being sucked away. I was mentally and emotionally exhausted from trying to hold my ground and constantly having to justify my need for space. I took a few hours to collect myself before sending one final message. I made it clear that if they showed up at my home uninvited, I would call the police. I wasn't being dramatic, I was serious. I told them this wasn't up for negotiation, and if they really respected me, they would back off and let me live my life without interference. The next day, I got an unexpected call from a cousin on my dad's side, a cousin who almost never calls me. She'd apparently heard through the family grapevine that I'd threatened my parents with police action, and she wanted to know what was going on. At that point, it felt like my life had turned into some kind of twisted family soap opera, with everyone inserting themselves into my business and offering their opinions. My cousin kept saying things like, "Your parents have been through so much," and "Isn't there a way to work this out peacefully?" I could hardly believe what I was hearing. It was like they were all more concerned with protecting my parents' feelings than acknowledging the damage they'd done to me. It felt like everyone was reading from the same script, all trying to guilt me into falling in line with the story my parents had spun for them. In a moment of desperation, I went through all my social media profiles and tightened my privacy settings. I even blocked a few family members who had shown they couldn't resist meddling. I wasn't taking any more chances. I also decided to set up a P.O. box for any future mail. The thought occurred to me that if I continued resisting their attempts to contact me, they might resort to sending letters straight to my home. Then, something happened yesterday that cemented my decision to keep my boundaries firm. I got a notification from my apartment's management office. A visitor had asked the front desk to confirm if I lived there. Thankfully, the staff didn't give out any information, but the description they gave sounded exactly like my father. My heart started racing. It hit me just how far they were willing to go. It was like they believed that if they showed up in person, they could bulldoze through my defenses and talk their way back into my life. So here I am, still holding my ground, but feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and fear. I've spent years building my independence and learning how to stand up for myself, But this entire ordeal has made me question how much strength I have left to keep fighting them off. A small part of me feels a pang of guilt, wondering if they'll ever truly understand why I need this space, or if they're just too lost in their own perspective to see it. But then, I remind myself of the years of manipulation, the emotional blackmail, and the constant reminder that my life was never really my own when I was around them. Update 3. Hey everyone! It's been almost a month since everything escalated, and thankfully, I have some good news to share. It's brought me a little peace. My boyfriend and I finally decided it was time to move in together. We've been planning this for a while, but after everything that happened with my parents, we became more certain that this was the right time. We found a small, but cozy apartment a few towns over. It felt like a fresh start, a place far enough away that it gave me distance from the old address my parents had somehow found. We finalized the move just last week, and while I'm still being cautious, I finally feel like I've put some much-needed space between myself and their reach. It's a huge relief knowing that if they try to track me down again, they'll have to work even harder. And hopefully they won't. Through all of this, I've stayed in close contact with my best friend. She's been my rock and my sounding board throughout these chaotic weeks. Recently, she attended a gathering where my parents happened to be as well. I wasn't thrilled to hear they'd be in the same room, but I trusted her to handle it however she saw fit. Apparently, my parents have taken their narrative to a whole new level. They've been telling anyone who'll listen that I abandoned them, that I'm ungrateful, and that after everything they did for me, I just walked out of their lives and disrespected them. My friend told me she kept calm at first, just listening without saying anything. But things escalated. According to her, they painted me as some spoiled, selfish kid who used them up and left the moment I didn't need them anymore. They spoke about my disrespect for family values, and how heartbroken they were that I refused to forgive them. My mom even went on a rant about all the sacrifices they'd supposedly made for me growing up, spinning the story to make it seem like I'd betrayed them by turning my back on the duties I owed them as their daughter. Hearing all of this made me feel sick to my stomach. The way they twisted the truth into this warped version of events was beyond hurtful. It hurt to know they were spreading this fabricated story to people who didn't know the real situation. But honestly, should I have expected anything different? My friend didn't let it slide. She stepped up, called them out in front of everyone, and laid everything bare. She told the room about the years of manipulation and emotional abuse I endured. She explained how they constantly dismissed and controlled me, only reaching out to me when it was convenient for them, especially when they needed financial help. She didn't stop there. She made sure everyone knew how they tracked me down, ignored my boundaries, and even tried to show up at my home unannounced despite me explicitly asking them not to. She didn't hold anything back. When she told me what happened, I was stunned. I could hardly believe she'd gone to bat for me like that, and with such honesty and courage. Her support hit me in a way I didn't even know I needed. The most surprising part? My parents didn't deny a single thing she said. They sat there in silence, occasionally muttering things like, "We did a lot for her," or, "But she's our daughter." Not once did they try to refute her statements or offer their side of the story. They just sat there, looking uncomfortable and embarrassed. According to my friend, it was obvious that, for the first time, they were surrounded by people who weren't automatically taking their side. They couldn't spin the narrative to make themselves the victims, and I think it finally hit them how much they'd messed up. After that confrontation, there was a noticeable shift in how others treated my parents. The social status they'd relied on for so long seemed to evaporate. People who used to gravitate toward them started keeping their distance, unwilling to get involved in the mess my parents had created. They were left to fend for themselves, stripped of the constant validation and support they'd leaned on to prop up their image. I hadn't realized until then just how much they craved external approval, and how important it was for them to be seen as respected members of the community. Now that their facade had been shattered, they'd lost the control and influence that made them feel powerful. Despite all this, they didn't stop trying to get through to me. I kept getting messages and emails, long-winded pleas filled with emotional appeals, guilt trips, and dramatic claims about how I was breaking up the family and tearing them apart. Some of the emails were practically essays about how I was supposedly disappointing them in ways they never thought possible. They even resorted to calling me from blocked numbers, leaving me lengthy voicemails that I stopped listening to altogether. This dragged on for a while, and eventually, I realized I had to take a firmer stand. I sent them one final email, a short, no-nonsense message that laid everything out plainly. I told them that if they didn't stop their harassment, I would involve the police. I made it clear that their behavior was veering into territory that could legally be considered stalking, and I wouldn't hesitate to file a restraining order if they continued. I spelled it out as simply as possible, hoping the threat of legal action would finally make them understand that I was serious about enforcing my boundaries. The next few days were tense. Then, I received one last email from my mother. It was packed with over-the-top, emotional statements about how they'd only ever tried to do what was best for me, and how I was throwing away the only family I had. But there was one line that stood out, a subtle jab meant to scare me. She wrote, "One day, you'll regret this decision. You'll look back and wonder why you couldn't just let things go." That kind of veiled threat used to get under my skin, but this time, it only strengthened my resolve. It made me even more certain that I was doing the right thing. After that final message, everything went quiet. The silence felt like an immense weight lifting off my shoulders. For the first time, I felt like I was reclaiming the freedom I'd been fighting for all along. It was strange to think that they might actually be backing off, though I'm not holding my breath. I don't know if this chapter with my parents is truly closed, or if they're just regrouping to try again later. For now, though, the quiet is a blessing. I'm using this time to focus on myself, my relationship, and the new life I'm building, one without their interference. Reddit, I'm not sure what the future holds with my parents. Maybe this is the end, or maybe they'll find another way to try to pull me back in. But for now, I'm content with the steps I've taken to protect my happiness and peace. It's been a long journey, one I'm still navigating, but I finally feel like I've found solid ground and stepped out of the chaos of my family's mess. Thank you all for being here. Your support has meant more than I can say.